Good evening. The rich are getting out, and the rest of us are getting nervous. Even Peter Kyle, the business secretary, admits that company directors and the well-off are leaving Britain because of new taxes. Today's rumours about what's in the budget include whacking people living in expensive houses. Now, particularly in Budget Week, I want to keep away from rumours and focus on what we know. Tonight, that includes a warning from business in the shape of the head of the Confederation of British Industry, Rain Newton-Smith, who begs the Chancellor to change course and avoid death by 1,000 taxes for industry. This is a time of year when the question, what is reporting and what is lobbying, is particularly tricky. Business is doing well in the lobbying stakes so far. The same Peter Kyle has promised a cut of up to 25% in the energy bills for 7,000 companies. At the same time, by the way, when most of us will be paying more for our energy. And a review of workers' rights legislation is coming too. By and large, and this is just life, it is the wealthiest and the most powerful who have the biggest megaphones. But whether or not it causes a disastrous flight of capital from Britain, tax the rich is still the solution favoured by voters. And those who don't have a big megaphone are already getting some good news. Rail fares are to be frozen for the first time in 30 years in England next year. The Chancellor has already made it clear she is going to lift the two-child cap, with child poverty being one of the reasons for having a Labour Party in the first place. But none of these decisions have been easy, and inside government there have been stand-up, proper, shouting arguments between ministers. Treasury people blame Number 10 for leaking the decision not to raise income tax after all, but advisers in Number 10, who always hated the idea of breaking the manifesto, blame the Treasury for making a Horlicks of the run-up to the budget. And I'm told the Prime Minister is in private furious. One thing, finally, that is abundantly clear is that we are not going to get the budget we were promised. Here, to remind you of that, is Rachel Reeves speaking a year ago to the CBI.
I'm really clear. I'm not coming back with more borrowing or more taxes. And that is why, at this budget, we did wipe the slate clean to put public finances and public services on a firm footing. And as a result, we won't have to do a budget like this ever again.
Oh, good. Let's talk now to the former CEO of Sainsbury's, Justin King. What is his impression of wealthier Britain? Are people really heading for the exit route?
I personally have seen business acquaintances over the years come and go, but there definitely feels like there's a lot more going and coming at the moment. The narrative tends to focus on the very, very wealthy and non-domicile status, but it seems to me that the comments from the business secretary today were much more focused on what you might call the sort of middle ranks of business, and indeed I think you referred to doctors as well. And I think when professional people are leaving, or when entrepreneurs are going somewhere else to start their businesses or sell their businesses, then we should be worried, because that affects all of us.
If you ask people, the general public in opinion polls, what should be done about our current economic problems, tax the rich is a very, very popular answer. What would you say to people who give that answer?
Well, it is a popular answer, but of course I think it starts from a lack of knowledge. We already do tax the rich, and the vast majority of the rich in this country do pay their taxes. It's much too, I think, simplistic to imply that the rich somehow dodge. The truth of the matter is the top 1% of earners in this country, who account for about 12% of income in this country, pay about 26% of the tax in this country. I think, given that that's a starting point, you can have a more sensible conversation then about how much more we should tax the rich, and there's always that argument. But I think what everybody knows is that unless the majority of all of us pay more tax, it won't raise the kinds of money that the Chancellor says that she needs.
It would have been politically extremely dangerous to break the manifesto pledge, therefore, and raise income tax, but might that have been economically the best thing to do?
Personally, I think so, yes, because it would appear that the choice that's now being made is not to allow the various bands for tax to increase. That's something that's existed now for a while, started by a Conservative Chancellor. And the result of that is that around 3 million people more pay tax in the UK than did at the start of this decade before COVID. Now, on the one hand, they are the least well-off in our society generally, so that must be a bad thing, drawing those people into the tax net. On the other hand, I think it has changed the conversation a bit. The more people that pay tax, the more they realise that it's their money that government's spending. And I think that's a bit been missing from this conversation. It isn't simply a straightforward choice between tax more or spend less. And in fact, the biggest thing the government can do is spend better.
I've been watching carefully all the statistics about business confidence and the rest of it. And it seems to me that the run-up to this budget, perhaps in particular, has been such a melodrama that it has stopped people spending around the country. It's stopped businesses expanding. It's stopped people hiring. Do you think the budget itself has become a problem?
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, I think the timing of the budget, the way, I don't think it's seriously denied, the way that policies have been leaked to see how they get responded to has been a shambles, and a very long one at that. We've had this long run-in. You know, my background is retail, and business doesn't exist in a vacuum. The most important thing for retail businesses is consumer confidence, and we just had an extended period of uncertainty. It's impacted on consumer confidence. It's definitely impacted on business confidence as a result. But of course, we've had the long legacy of last year's budget. You know, it caught most people by surprise. It was a tax on business. And I think what it's proven is that if you tax business, it's not something that doesn't have an effect on all of us. It's definitely affected the job market. There are fewer jobs advertised today than for a very long time, perhaps 100,000 fewer than this time last year. And unemployment is growing. That's been one of the positives of our economy for the last 10 years. So that's truly disappointing. And ultimately, inflation was driven up as well. That's a pretty bad set of outcomes from last year's budget.
I'm trying to stay away from the rumours around the budget. As you say, there have been so many of them, it's hard to know where to start. But thinking of what we know for sure, we know that Peter Kyle, the business secretary, has said that he's looking again at some of the workers' rights agenda because of business worries about it. We know that the biggest businesses in the UK are going to be offered a fairly substantial cut in their energy costs. And we also know that he is concerned about the number of people leaving the country, and there's a bit of a nod there. It seems to me that so far, in the pre-budget period at least, business has done rather well. What do you think is the priority for business going forward?
Well, as I said earlier in the conversation, I don't think you should view business in a vacuum. If business taxes go up, that will tend to flow through in impacts on jobs and inflation. And if the government is going to choose a different place to tax, the question then comes whether that has a positive or perhaps at best neutral effect on the economy. You know, the number one thing I would want with businesses I've worked in is consumer confidence. Actually, you know, in the round, people are getting still good wage awards, and those wage awards in the last 12 months have been beating inflation. But we're also saving a lot more, and this is an economy that has been driven really for generations by being a spending economy. We're very consumer-facing, and ultimately, therefore, consumer confidence is the number one thing we'd look for in the Chancellor's measures.
Well, that is a slightly more optimistic worldview than we've heard from some people. Thank you for that. Looking forward, generally speaking, are you worried or are you relatively optimistic about what we're going to hear later in the week?
Oh, I think I remain worried because I think the process that we've seen leading up to this has been very poor. We've seen some of the commentary in the last few days, whether it be Andy Haldane, formerly of the Bank of England, or indeed just today, the head of the CBI, who, funny enough, is also ex-Bank of England, just as I believe the Chancellor is, sounding the warning sign around the complexity of taxes on business, and wouldn't it be better if we just had a simple solution to the government's tax-raising powers? But as I touched on earlier, for me, what I would like to see, and I'm not hearing it, and why I'd be therefore a little bit more downbeat, is a conversation about how well that money is spent. If you look at public sector productivity, since the start of this decade, it's declined by about 5%. Private sector productivity in that time has increased by about 3%. That 8% gap between the two sectors' performance would be around £80 billion, a much more material number than any of the ones the Chancellor is currently worrying about closing the gap. So public sector productivity getting a grip on the money, the over £1 trillion a year that the government spends of our money, is really the number one thing I hope to hear something about, but don't have high expectation.
Well, there is a really important and key message, not just for the Chancellor, but for all her cabinet colleagues. Justin, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC tonight.
Thank you.
Now, I mentioned the changes to workers' rights legislation a little earlier, and one man whose life's work is to protect those rights is Paul Nowak, the General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress, which represents about 5.5 million workers throughout England and Wales. Paul, very good to have you on the show. You will have heard the kind of background noise about the government coming under huge pressure from business and pro-growth economists to water down some of the new rights for workers, and they're particularly worried, I think, about this idea of workers being able to sue their employers from day one for wrongful dismissal.
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, Andrew, we've heard those voices ever since the government published its plan to make work pay. And I mean, I haven't seen any material change today. This is a massive piece of legislation, does cover everything from, as you say, day one employment rights, not just protections against unfair dismissal, but things like access to sick pay, guaranteed hours contracts, outlawing fire and rehire. It's a very important piece of legislation. And with a piece of legislation that big, there was always going to be the need to consult with employers and with unions. And in fact, that's something the government's been doing over the course of the last 16 months, to be honest with you. I've been sat in rooms with the CBI, the Federation of Small Businesses, and others on many occasions talking about the Employment Rights Bill. We're very, very clear. This is an important piece of legislation. It's one that is hugely popular with the British public, most popular actually with Labour to Reform switches, and it's one that the public will expect the government to deliver. That's what's in the manifesto, and people will expect them to deliver on that plan to make work pay.
But something is going badly wrong in the labour market at the moment in terms of the number of vacancies and the number of people getting jobs. I'm thinking particularly of people coming out of college or university or school, whatever, for the first time coming into the labour market. And employers say part of the trouble is the fear that the first day you employ somebody, you have legal risks in doing that, and that is stopping people employing.
I just don't buy that argument, Andrew. This is a piece of legislation that wouldn't take effect for another 2 years, and those pressures on employment are happening right now. And I think there's a whole host of reasons there, whether it's the impact of Brexit, high energy prices, the state of our public services. I mean, the whole set of pressures on our economy. But you know, I agree. There's a particular set of issues, certainly for young people, 1 million young people not in education or training or in work. And the government, I think, has been right to sort of talk about a proper youth jobs guarantee for those young people. But, you know, there's still a mixed picture out there, because I go into lots of workplaces up and down the country. And at the same time, we've got employers saying they can't get the skilled people they need to fill the vacancies they've got. So, you know, that speaks to the government's broader agenda around industrial strategy and national infrastructure pipeline. But clearly, I don't take anybody not being able to find work lightly at all. But I think that claim around the Employment Rights Bill is completely overstated.
I just wonder, with the great revolution coming from AI, which is going to kind of hammer lots of jobs, particularly white-collar jobs and administrative jobs and so on, whether these might not be virtuous and decent measures just coming at the wrong time for the British economy.
No, I think they're coming up at absolutely the right time, to be honest with you, Andrew. And we had just heard from Justin King there, and he talked about consumer confidence. Well, our members are the people who go out and spend money in Sainsbury's and other supermarkets and buy local goods and services. And when you're in low-paid, insecure employment, it's hard to plan for the future, and it's hard to take the risk on building a new extension or buying a new car or booking a holiday. We've got a situation at the moment where work doesn't pay for far too many people. 1 in 6 workers are skipping meals because they can't make ends meet. We know there will be people listening to this programme this evening, and millions of people up and down the country who won't switch on the heating this winter because they're worried about paying the bills. And so that's why I think we need the Employment Rights Bill delivered in full, but we also need a budget that delivers for working people and on living standards in particular. And whether that's action on energy bills, lifting that 2-child benefit cap, practical action to boost the minimum wage, these are all things that are going to put money in people's pockets.
Well, we've got broad hints from the Chancellor and today from the Prime Minister that you're going to get a lot of what you want. Paul Nowak, thanks very much indeed for talking to LBC. Now, for a bit more on the detail of what's being trailed from the budget so far, our political correspondent, Aggie Shornbury, is here with me. Aggie, I mentioned the mansion tax, or people in rich houses earlier on. That is one of those rumours which is hardening up, as it were, and we kind of think it's definitely going to happen, yeah?
Well, Labour MPs think it's definitely going to happen. So I think conversations have been taking place between, for example, London Labour MPs and the Chancellor, and I think they're continuing to take place. In fact, as we speak, Andrew, Rachel Reeves is addressing the Parliamentary Labour Party, where I'm sure she's facing many questions about what this budget will look like. But as you say, mansion tax, or something that's being dubbed a mansion tax, is increasingly looking likely. I think partly because, that phrase that she and the Prime Minister use about the broadest shoulders facing the biggest burden, I think that is kind of helpful to their narrative. But how a mansion tax or a so-called mansion tax would actually work, there is some reporting around today that basically they would use the council tax banding and the 3 most expensive houses in the council tax banding and sort of use those and then say, OK, you're going to now pay this extra amount of money. And
that includes almost, not all, but very, very many houses, for instance, in London and the South East. I mean, I live in a brick terraced house which was built for the skilled working classes back in the day, but would now be characterised as, quote, a mansion.
Well, the point is, the council tax, lots of people would say, is a sort of antiquated system. It was your house, as everybody else's, was described to be in whatever council tax band it's in 1991, and those bandings haven't changed. But obviously, the cost of houses have changed absolutely hugely. So I think there is frustration from Labour MPs and other people that they aren't doing a kind of wholesale change of how this system works, and instead it looks like sort of tacking onto that council tax system and saying that some things are mansions when others would argue they're not.
All right, Aggie, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, up next, after a dramatic weekend of negotiations over Trump's proposed peace deal for Ukraine, has Ukraine been stabbed in the back by the United States? We're going to talk about that next, but you're listening to Tonight with Andrew Marr, at the time now 6:18. 6:21. Last week, I said I feared that Ukraine was being stabbed in the back by the latest American so-called peace proposal ultimatum. Since then, things have got steadily grimmer for President Zelenskyy. The Russians will keep fighting and reject any European changes short of surrender by Kiev. The view in Downing Street is that they have to stay calm, stay in the game, and try to persuade President Trump that Ukraine must have proper defences if it gives up territory, and that rump Ukraine requires a much stronger European guarantee. But everything is on edge, as well as being on the table. And this is a genuinely perilous moment. Let's hear from the leader of the Golos party in the Ukrainian parliament, Kira Rudik, who gave me her reaction to the proposed deal.
It's not a surprise for us, right? When we heard first about the 28-point plan, we were asking, how would President Trump, who was not able to get Russia to a first step of any negotiation, to a ceasefire, how would he push, pressure, whatever, Putin into agreeing to any sort of plan? Because right now, when everybody discussing these peace negotiations, here on the ground in Ukraine, nothing has changed. Russia continues attacking us. People are dying. People are dying at the front line. And people are dying in their beds in the peaceful cities because Russia continues attacking. So the question that everybody's asking is not answered. What is the leverage to make Putin agree to a peace deal? Right now, there is no reason for him to end the war. However, he has a reason to drag the negotiations to evade the sanctions that President Trump threatened him with. So this is why I'm not very optimistic.
Isn't it the sad truth that Putin thinks he's winning the war at the moment, because he is? Ukraine is losing an awful lot of people on the front line, people leaving, literally walking away or deserting, and the Russian assault goes on and on. They appear to be able to find yet more people for their so-called meat grinder. You're a smaller country and you are struggling.
Russia is, of course, bigger, and it's an authoritarian regime where they can get as many people as they need. We are a democracy, and of course we are struggling. We always knew that it was a David versus Goliath situation, and it didn't become much better. However, if you look at the territorial gains and losses, for example, between 2023 and right now, they're not much different. And this gives us lots of hope that the political promises of our allies will become additional weapons in our hands, and so we can continue defending ourselves. Look, Andrew, there is no other nation that wants this war to end more than us. We have all paid an enormous price, an ultimate price, to be where we are right now. But we cannot do it at any cost, Because let me ask you this. If Russia doesn't plan to attack us in the nearest future after the peace deal, why would they care how many people we have in our army? Why would anybody care how many people we have in our army? Why is this point even there if nobody plans to attack Ukraine in the nearest future?
Because they want you completely under their control, I think, is the real answer to that question. A lot of people thought that the 28-point plan announced by Washington was basically written by Moscow, or a lot of it was written by Moscow. And when President Zelenskyy addressed the Ukrainian people, he said there was a very, very hard choice between humiliation on the one hand and losing Ukraine's biggest ally. It sounded to me as if he was prepared to agree to certain aspects of this peace proposal, however painful they may be.
Andrew, it was never a question for us to choose between our partners and our dignity. We have made our choice in 2022 when the situation was much worse. We remember how we were talking when Russians were surrounding Kyiv, and we didn't have so many allies as we have right now. So yes, situation is dire, but we are not at the point where we can just give up. We didn't do it in 2022. We do not intend to do it right now. However, I think we should continue these negotiations because there is one positive note that is happening. For the first time in a while, probably in history, the United States are saying that they will provide security guarantees, the real security guarantees, not the Budapest Memorandum security guarantees. We do not know what that means, but at least this is in this like 27, 19-point plan, whatever. And this is something that can be a breakthrough because ending the war, knowing that Russia will be just waiting for us to become weaker and then attacking us again, is not something that we can achieve and we can approve here. But actually having all our partners working together, providing the security guarantees for this territory that Ukraine controls right now, I think this is something that brings some hope.
Kira, can I ask you directly? Again, President Zelenskyy warned of a very difficult or harsh winter ahead for Ukraine. Do you think your country can last the winter and into next year?
I want to remind you that in 2022, people were not giving us more than 2 or 3 days. Andrew, right now I am talking to you on a diesel generator. I'm in Kyiv. I have electricity for 3, sometimes 5 hours a day. It's very hard. But is it hard to the point where we can just give up? Is it even fair to the people who are fighting at the front line, to the people who lost their relatives in this war? I think we still have it in ourselves. No matter how hard it is, we are still a free country. We are fighting for our survival, and we just need to push together, and especially having our partners behind us. Because what I think we are not talking enough, what would happen if we lose?
Very courageous words, and I'm sure everybody listening will agree with them. But can I ask you about one more difficult issue, which is President Zelenskyy and this corruption scandal around the nuclear power plant? All sorts of stories coming out, and I think an awful lot of your fellow citizens are very, very angry with the regime over it.
I am angry too, because same as our citizens, I'm sitting without the electricity, and I have heard and have seen on those videos how people were taking cash somewhere. Yeah. And it is incredibly annoying. And President Zelenskyy will be defined by his reaction to this scandal, because he can either go ahead and dismiss the government, and we can try and form a new parliamentary coalition, because we cannot have elections right now, but we can propose a new government that will consist of new people who will be working for Ukraine. Or president can try to pretend that nothing happened, and then it will be much harder for Ukraine again to continue putting our trust in him. Since the beginning of full-scale invasion, I was supporting president, and we were all working as one team. But there is like red lines here as well. And again, stealing on energy sector, stealing in the military purchases is something that we just, this is something where our survival depends on it. And this is why we are still waiting for the president to do the right thing.
And if he fails to do that, do you think he's the right person to carry on leading Ukraine?
Well, we cannot elect a different president, at this time, but the trust to him will definitely go down. And I hope that he realizes that.
Kira, thank you very much for talking to LBC tonight, and our very best wishes to you all.
Thank you, and glory to Ukraine.
Kira Rudik there. We're going to hear a bit more on Trump's so-called peace deal in a few minutes. Plus, BBC executives are still facing a grilling from MPs after a difficult few weeks, plagued by accusations of bias and misconduct. We'll get all the latest from our political editor, but the time now, 6:29, and Tim Humphrey has your news headlines.
With Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:32. Now, it's very hard, indeed nigh on impossible, to truly understand what's going on in President Trump's head. But what do the events of the last few days tell us about where the president currently stands on the war in Ukraine and his relationship with both Putin and Zelenskyy? Daniel Fried is the former US Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. He was also at one time the US ambassador to Poland, and he played a central role in coordinating the West's sanctions against Russia after the 2014 aggression against Ukraine. He joins me now. Mr. Fried, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Can I start off by putting something to you, with a question mark at the end, which is that Donald Trump saw that President Zelenskyy, right now for different reasons, was in a very weak position, seized his moment and has pounced?
I don't know the origins of this latest peace proposal. It may have come from Donald Trump. I think it more likely that Special Envoy Steve Witkoff with Kirill Dmitriev, his Russian counterpart, cooked this up, got a kind of general blessing from Donald Trump, and jammed it. So it broke last week. And we've been suddenly off to the races, moving very fast.
And everybody has been taken by surprise, including all the European leaders. They didn't see this coming. And a general sense of shock has spread right through Kiev as well.
Well, that's right. Look, can we just stipulate that the original U.S. proposal, both in the form and the substance, was what we call in the U.S. a hot mess? All right, let's just stipulate that. But my reaction was, as a former diplomat, how can I make this work? What can I do with this? And there, the Ukrainians and the Europeans have reacted well, I think, as has Secretary Rubio. That is, instead of throwing up their hands and complaining, they tried to take this mess of the 28 points and move it in the right direction so it could be the basis for a sustainable peace. Now, that's an uphill battle, because the Russians helped shape this at the beginning. But the Geneva talks yesterday seem to have done quite a bit of good. And so my question is not how bad the origins were, but how good we can make this if we're finally working together.
That's a very positive way of looking at it. It's been suggested to me from inside the British government that having Marco Rubio there at the centre is one of the silver linings. In other words, he is one of the most positive and optimistic figures that the Americans could be providing.
Well, absolutely. He is, how shall I put this, a kind of Reaganite within the Trump administration. And he's not the only one, by the way. There are a number in the administration and in Trump world who believe in, how shall I say this, the free world. And they think it is in American interest to see Russia fail to conquer Ukraine, and I agree with them. It's good to have the British involved, by the way. I know Jonathan Powell from some previous incarnations, first rate. So you now have the Europeans talking to the Americans, talking to the Ukrainians, and you apparently have a much better draft that's on the table, though it's not finalized. Rough days lie ahead, but at least we're no longer in a complete meltdown as we appeared to be Saturday night.
And the big problem seems to be obviously persuading the Russians that a modified deal, modified by the Europeans to give Ukraine a little bit of security going forward, won't be acceptable to the Kremlin. In other words, whether you can get a deal which protects Ukraine and Putin will accept has always been the conundrum that President Trump has been wrestling with. And it's not clear that that conundrum has been resolved.
Well, I think it's clear that it hasn't been resolved. That is, this is the tactical mistake the American negotiators made. We allowed the Kremlin, through Kirill Dmitriev, to shape the first draft. Then we have to negotiate the final draft with the Russians so they get 2 bites at the apple. Now, I don't know how Witkoff does real estate business, but that doesn't strike me as a very good negotiating tactic. So we're starting out from behind and playing catch up. But I agree that having Rubio in the center is very good, and there are serious people around Rubio. There are people part of the administration and part of Trump world who want to do the right thing because it's in America's interest to do the right thing.
I said right at the beginning of our conversation, it's hard to read President Trump, and it may be impossible. But I'm really struck by the change in tone since the summer, when he appeared to be very irritated, borderline angry with President Putin, thought he was not a fair actor and was threatening all sorts of oil sanctions, to where we are now. He seems to have gone right back to the beginning.
Well, you have a basis for that complaint, let us say. However, we know that Trump doesn't stay in one place. We also know that his MO is to put pressure, maximum pressure, on whatever party he wants to push at the moment. That is not necessarily a sign of where he ends up. So Trump wanted Ukraine to sign on to his initiative. So he puts pressure on Ukraine. Now the Ukrainians have signed on in principle to the Trump initiative. So it may be that once we come up with a decent draft, the Russians will have to decide whether to be jerks and simply try to negotiate everything, or negotiate in earnest. If they are jerks, and the initial signs are they're likely to be, then Trump may turn around and put pressure on them. It wasn't just words with Trump. A couple of weeks ago, those new sanctions on the big Russian oil companies, Lukoil and Rosneft, were serious. So Trump can put pressure on the Russians. He has the options. Look, as you hear, I'm trying to make the best of a bad start, but it was my professional instincts that kicked in, and I asked myself, don't simply describe the stink bomb that's on the table. Try to fix it, and that's how I'm approaching this problem.
A stink bomb, a hot mess. Mr. Fried, thank you very much for talking to LBC tonight. Now then, the BBC advisor whose report sparked the latest crisis and ultimately the resignation of the Director General, Tim Davie, does not think the corporation is institutionally biased. But Michael Prescott did tell the Commons Media Select Committee this afternoon he thought the now notorious Panorama programme was biased badly against Donald Trump, and that the Conservative board member Sir Robbie Gibb, who appointed him, was a friend. If you're interested in the details of the scandal that did more than any other to damage the BBC in recent times, this evidence session in the Commons, which continues right now, has been absolutely fascinating. In a moment, we're going to hear from Alan Rusbridger, the former Guardian and Prospect editor. But let's begin with our own political editor, Natasha Clark. Natasha, you have been watching this long session, and we've seen Samir Shah, the chairman of the BBC. We've seen Caroline Thompson from the BBC board. We've seen Sir Robbie Gibb. And, of course, we've seen Mr. Prescott himself. What do you think the big takeouts have been?
Yeah, Andrew, it's been fascinating to watch, and we don't really talk about select committees as being very punchy or very exciting, but it is absolutely fascinating to see how all these little bits of the BBC slot together. And as you say, today we've mainly been hearing, in the last hour or so anyway, from the BBC chairman Samir Shah. He has apologised over the handling of the editing of that Donald Trump documentary, which is why all of this really came to a head. We also heard from Sir Robbie Gibb, he's on the BBC board, and Michael Prescott, as you say. The current chairman, Samir Shah, under a lot of pressure from MPs, I think it's clear from listening to their questioning. He told MPs today that he did not think the Director General, Tim Davie, should have resigned, and he tried to stop him from doing so.
I do not think the Director General should have resigned. I think that the act by the Director of News was an honourable and proper act. I think she took responsibility, for which I will again say I applaud her for doing so. I do not think that meant that the Director General had also had to resign. However, when you read the Director General's reason for resigning. Certainly this was one factor, but he also says there were many other factors that led to that. I wish, and can I say the board wishes, that the Director General had not resigned. He had our full confidence.
And he pointedly as well refused to answer a question about whether he blocked the BBC from issuing an apology. He said he wanted to do far more than that. I also thought it was fascinating hearing from Sir Robbie Gibb totally slapping down any accusations that there was a board-level coup, calling that complete nonsense. He said he feels like he's become weaponised because he's a Tory, of course. He was appointed by Boris Johnson. He said impartiality runs through my bones. Prescott, I thought his evidence was fascinating. He insisted he didn't think there was institutional bias, but he did feel problems were just not taken seriously. Obviously, we know the BBC sat on his report for 3 months and basically did nothing. That was really interesting to hear from him.
And he also thought that his own report wasn't completely fair to the BBC. It was a sort of summary of somebody else's work, and he was using it for particular reasons. And when he was asked how he ended up on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, he didn't really have an answer, did he?
No idea, Gov. Not me. Absolutely. Hold his hands up and say this is not due to me. But he did admit that after the BBC basically sat on that report and did nothing for 3 months, he did then hand it over to the Select Committee. He did then hand it over to Ofcom. He just says that he felt that Tim Davie, obviously the former Director General, had what he called a, quotes, blind spot. So, but I think really all of the attention will today and it's this evening be on Samir Shah. Of course, this was a bit of a make or break appearance for him, but just listen to some of the questions from the MPs on that committee. It's very clear that they are very far from confident that he is able to solve all of the numerous problems that the BBC have at the moment.
Really interesting, Natasha. Thank you so much for that. And now, as promised, let's hear from Alan Rusbridger, the former editor of The Guardian and editor of Prospect magazine. Alan, you have been following this in great detail, I know. What do you think you learned today from the committee's inquiry?
Well, it may not have been a coup, but it was a PR coup by whoever decided to leak this to the Telegraph. Because after a couple of hours, you thought, well, what is all the fuss around? What is the fuss that has brought down a Director General and a head of news and led to this enormous storm? Because when it came down to it, Prescott was pressed about the BBC and whether, how bad it was. He said the following: the BBC gets as close as any organisation in the world ever has to be effective and trusted arbiter of impartiality. So that's the man who wrote this dossier. Gibb was asked, do you believe the BBC is institutionally biased? No, he doesn't believe that. So it was a series of squabbles in this funny little committee at the heart of the BBC, which got out of control. And I think a lot of people will have watched it today and thought, how did it get so out of control?
So I've been keeping one eye on this and one eye on the rest of the news, as is my job, Alan. But I got the impression also that Michael Prescott accepted that his report wasn't a fair overall assessment or survey of what was going on in the BBC. It was, in its own way, unbiased or one-sided a bit. Yes, and that was what was leaked.
Yeah, he had cherry-picked the work of a number of reviews by a journalist called David Grossman. And he more or less admitted that he had cherry-picked it. And there was a marked difference between him and the other editorial advisor, a woman called Caroline Daniels, who was a former FT journalist, who said, went out of her way to really praise the BBC and to say that it was a really healthy organization, and to say that Prescott's cherry picking was, quotes, a personal account rather than a comprehensive review. So this document, which somehow ended up in the hands of the Telegraph, Prescott says it wasn't him, Gibb says it wasn't him, was then used to give a completely counter impression to what Prescott says he intended to say. And how Samir Shah allowed this to become such a crisis that both the DG and the head of news went wasn't really explained.
No, and Natasha was telling us just now that she thought that Samir Shah was under an awful lot of pressure from MPs. What's your own view of his position and his future as chairman?
I think I should say that Caroline Thompson, one of the board directors, said that there was unanimous confidence in Samir Shah. I think it's reasonable to ask why he has let this what was a crisis become nearly a catastrophe for the BBC, and why he didn't really explain why, having himself decided that this wasn't the Panorama programme, didn't contain anything that his committee should be looking at, why the BBC reacted so slowly to the Telegraph revelations. He tried to explain, but I don't think anyone really understood his answer.
It doesn't sound to me as if you would have confidence in Samir Shah as chairman.
I think he's doing his best. It's clearly a difficult situation, but an organization that is one of the great communications organizations in the world, to have sat completely impotent for a week, unable to say anything while this crisis spiraled out of control, on the basis of what we heard today, is inexplicable.
Do you have any personal feelings about who should be the next DG? I have to say, I've heard your name mentioned. I've heard Trevor Phillips's name mentioned. Trevor Phillips certainly isn't ruling himself out, and there are journalists inside and outside the BBC who I think are interested. What's your own position?
I think the interesting move in the last over the weekend was for the BBC to say that they were thinking of splitting the job effectively, that there should be a deputy director general. I think it would be better to call that an editor-in-chief, because that is a really responsible, arguably it's the most responsible role within the BBC. And I think that the DG should be somebody who can handle a £6 billion budget and a huge organisation, and leave the editor-in-chief to be responsible for 22,000 hours of content. When you think the last 4 or 5 director generals have all been brought low by news, it's clear that whoever does the job next has got to really concentrate on the news. But, remember Michael Prescott himself, his glowing words about the BBC and its reputation in general.
You have elegantly failed to give me a name, but that was absolutely fascinating. Alan Rusbridger, thank you very much indeed for that.
Conversation, LBC, tonight with Andrew Marr.
6:50. Now, at the beginning of the show, I mentioned that figure of 16,500 millionaires leaving Britain during the course of this year alone. That's a number put out by Henley and Partners, who specialise in advising people who want to move, and they call themselves a firm for global citizens. I've been wondering where all the super rich go. I have to say that personally, Dubai, with its impoverished migrant working class, baking heat, glass towers and sand dunes, doesn't do it for me. But there are rumours that northern Italy is now the in destination. Let's talk now to Peter Ferrigno, the Director of Tax Services at Henley and Partners. Peter, thanks for joining us. Where are all these people going?
I think it very much depends where they want to go, as you say, what they need and what they're looking for. As you say, the UAE is the top for inbound investor migration. But it's not only Dubai. Some people increasingly are finding Abu Dhabi slightly less extreme than Dubai may be. So that's quite popular. Other places that are also popular, as you say, in northern Italy is good, or Italy as a whole is good. There are other bits in southern Italy which have other tax incentives for pensioners, for example. Greece, Switzerland, Monaco. It really depends. Every place has its advantages and disadvantages.
So sunshine seems to be a very common advantage in all of them. If you go to Dubai or you go to the UAE or whatever, do you pay virtually no income tax? Is that the essential advantage?
If you do it correctly, then yes. Obviously, you have to actually leave the UK rather than just.
Well, you have to live there as well. That's the downside.
Yes. Yeah. Well, for some people it's the downside. Some people it's the upside. But yes, you have to establish tax residence, which does mean living there and moving there and having your centre of vital interests there, as they say in tax treaty speak.
And you're talking to these people all the time, obviously. To what extent overall is this caused by this Labour government and its taxes?
I think it is that is one of the issues that always comes up, but it's never that thing in isolation. And, clearly the government was elected to fix things which does require raising funds. The non-dom changes which kicked this thing off did originally get introduced by Jeremy Hunt on his way out the door, although they were reinforced by the Labour government last year. I think it's not only the tax changes. I think it's also a feeling that a handful of rich people are being asked to contribute more and more, and the broadest shoulders is a phrase that keeps coming up. And I think at some point people just thinking they want to go somewhere where maybe the view of the world is a bit more positive and forward thinking rather than just be trapped in a sort of spiral of negativity.
Just out of, I guess, what you could call tax voyeurism or something, I'm really interested in Italy because I read that the Italians are making a particular offer to the super rich or the very rich, and that Milan has become such a popular destination, it's even got its own English club.
I couldn't well believe that. I think the really interesting bit for me is that Italy modelled their whole high net worth tax incentive on our own non-dom scheme, which after we abolished it, they've benefited from, because saying that people that had no permanent connection with the UK that were choosing to be here for 5, 10, 15, 20 years wouldn't be taxable on their worldwide income was a system that had been there for 200 years. It was getting a bit old-fashioned and there were some gaps in it, but Italy has just picked up the ball and run with it. And people that are footloose that can move, Italy, they have a flat tax of 200,000 euros a year, which is potentially going up to 300,000 next year, but there are enough people where that is still a good deal. And I think the sad thing is that the UK could have a scheme like this and had a scheme like this. And it's not only the people leaving, it's the fact that they're not being replaced. And there is no simple way for wealthy Americans or Europeans to move to London, should they wish to, and contribute. I mean, there's been a lot of great work done by an organisation called Foreign Investors for Britain, which has basically said they can fix the budget gap if the UK was prepared to reintroduce a scheme it had in the past.
Well, more things for the Chancellor to chew on overnight. It may be a little bit late for that, but Peter, for now, thank you very much indeed. It's been called the richest shipwreck in history. The first treasures have been raised from the Spanish galleon, the San Jose, sunk by the British off Colombia in 1708. It was carrying treasure the Spanish intended to use in the then war against Britain and her allies. Cannon and beautiful handmade gold coins and a porcelain cup have so far been recovered. But who actually owns the loot? Big row about that. Let's talk to Charles Dean Beaker, underwater archaeologist and shipwreck conservationist. First of all, Charles, thanks very much for joining us tonight. Can you just put this shipwreck in the context of other shipwrecks that have been discussed in the past? I mean, how important is it? We've had the Mary Rose, we've had the Titanic and all the rest of it.
Well, certainly the San Jose has been on the list for treasure hunters for a number of years. Here in the United States, in 1966, we started treasure salvage laws in the state of Florida. Lots of archival work, lots of people looking in the archives of the Indies, and one of the things they ran across was the San Jose. And if you look at any of the early documents on treasure hunters and investors, they use this as the holy grail into the fact that in today's monetary values, the manifest might be as high as $17 billion in current value. So it's been there. People have thought about it. It's, of course, was found in 600 meters of water, almost 2,000 feet of water. It's deep, but it's the one that people have been looking for. If you wanted to find a shipwreck and you were doing it for monetary gain as a treasure salvor, then this is the one to get.
And there's been a private American company who found it quite early on and thought they had a deal, I think, with the Colombian government.
Well, that's not uncommon. You're talking about, in the early 1980s, the information was that they thought they had found it. Whether that's true or not, it's still somewhat of a debate. In those days, locational information and all. And I guess it's really kind of an academic exercise on that. What it boils down to is the Colombian government owns it. Several years ago, and before it was officially announced in 2015, a delegation from the Colombian government, presidential delegation, met me in Dominican Republic, and we're asking questions about salvage and how things were arranged. And I have a reputation for kind of doing alternatives, making underwater shipwreck parks or preserves, protected areas in the United States and the Dominican Republic. So, I told them, it's in your waters. There's going to be a lot of people legally contesting it, but the reality is it's in your waters.
And just very quickly, I've seen pictures of these huge gold coins. In terms of the amount of loot down there, it could be enormous.
Well, let's not call it loot or treasure. Let's call it, artifacts that have significance for the shipwreck and the time period. Certainly, it's a treasure ship. I can't call it anything else but that. But the fact that they've now shown the capacity building, the Colombian government, that this is not going to be a split, as I told them, whatever you do, don't sell the artifacts. Whatever you do, don't do a split where you get a salvage company to take 1% of it, because this is all, underwater cultural heritage by today's standards, 21st century, should be protected. It should be for public benefit. And in this case, the Colombian government has shown the capacity now to bring up heavy cannon, lightweight Ming Dynasty, and a few coins.
Yeah, well, Charles, what I wouldn't give to be able to go down there myself. It must be fascinating. Thank you very much for talking to LBC. We have got a big budgety show for you tomorrow with the CEO of ITSU, Julian Metcalf, the renowned businessman Sir Rocco Forte, Locations, Kirsty Allsop, and the Work and Pension Secretary, Pat McFadden. It is going to be an absolute corker, so make sure you join me tomorrow at 6 o'clock. If you've missed any of today's show, of course, you can listen back on our free Global Player app or the new LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest shows and opinion, put your news categories in the order you'd like them, pause, rewind live radio, and listen to a range of podcasts. So download the new official LBC app for free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, it's Ben Kentish.